All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Leading Against the Tide, New Skills for New Times virtual happy hour webcast hosted by Take the Lead. My name is Caitlin Radigan, and I will be moderating today's online discussion. And I am so excited to be moderating this webcast, which is hosted by Lex Schroeder. You may already know Lex from her Take the Lead Movement blog. She's a writer for the Take the Lead Movement blog, but I will let her introduce herself in just a moment. A few housekeeping items before we get started here. So if you have questions throughout the webcast, and we'll also have some time at the end of today's discussion to ask questions as well, but we encourage you to ask questions and submit your thoughts throughout the discussion. So you will notice underneath this video, there is a text box. And that's where you can submit your thoughts and any questions that you have for the Q&A at the end. So how it works is you just write in your questions and comments below where it says, type your message here, press enter to send. That's where you're going to type it. And in order for us to see your name, to know who's asking questions and who's submitting their thoughts, you can set your username by clicking the pencil icon, typing in your name, and then just pressing OK. And you will also notice that underneath the Q&A box, we have a Twitter feed going. So if you would like to tweet maybe a quote or something that is said during it or a thought during this virtual happy hour, just please use the hashtag #TakeLeadWomen and tag us at @TakeLeadWomen. And that's just another way that we can interact with each other throughout today's discussion. And one more thing is, if you can right now, grab a piece of paper and something to write with before we get started. There's a cool little exercise that we'll be doing later that you'll be using it for. So with that, I will hand it over to our thought leader who's leading today's virtual happy hour. Take it away, Lex.
Hi, I'm really excited to be doing this webcast. I've been working with Take the Lead for almost 2 years now, and working with Caitlin for almost as long. So thank you, Caitlin, for moderating and having this discussion. And it's important to me that this be a discussion with you all. So we're going to leave time for Q&A at the end. But if there's something that you really have a question about or want to interject with, I welcome that, and you can use that box on your screen to do that as well. So a little bit about me. I work primarily as an editor. That's sort of the day job, favorite job in some ways. It's kind of where I geek out and what I love. But I'm also a systems change thinker, whether that's organizational change, change kind of in society and culture around gender equity or gender balance in organizations, or system change in terms of how do you work with the collective intelligence of a group more effectively. So we can talk a lot about the need for difference in our communities and honoring difference and honoring different voices, but how do you actually work with that? Because once you have all that difference, it can actually be quite challenging. So along those lines, I do a lot of dialogue work and women's leadership work. So that's a bit about me and who you're talking with. And I'm really excited to be here because I so admire the mission of Take the Lead. And then a little bit about Take the Lead. Some of you know this already, but our goal is leadership parity by 2025. I believe the research shows that if we don't ramp things up in terms of our own ability to step into leadership and challenge systems so that women have that opportunity, then it's going to take until 2075 or 2080. So just sit with that for a minute in terms of a statistic. And Take the Lead is also about rethinking power and our very relationship to power, with women's leadership activists and scholars and thinkers, and a lot of women in past generations have been working on for decades, or much longer, rethinking power. And then Take the Lead is also about creating community, and they do that through programming. They do that through resources like this wonderful Close the Gap app on pay equity. Very helpful also in terms of thinking just about your career path. And they do that through community building, which Caitlin has done a tremendous job of, and others Take the Lead as well. So we can get started, but that's a little bit about who I am and a little bit about Take the Lead's mission.
Great, thank you for that, Lex. So in today's virtual happy hour, we will be delving into a few different things. So I will just go through those before we jump right in here. So the first is we're going to be discussing old and new definitions of both leadership and power, the importance of authentic leadership and exactly what that means, the difference between power and influence. We're going to see some examples of powerful, authentic leadership that changes the larger system and leads to new and different outcomes. So that'll be really cool for you all to see tangible examples of that. And then, of course, ending with concrete actions you all can take to lead more powerfully or change the way you work. So let's get started. So Lex, why is it necessary, first of all, to redefine leadership and power? Why do we need to redefine those?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. As a writer, I think a lot about what words mean and the many different meanings words have. So we're all going to have our own take on words, and at the same time, they mean what they mean, right? But it's with words like leadership and power, they actually get misconstrued and misused over time, not just kind of as words, but as concepts. And so the research and scholarship and story of leadership and power is really fascinating, and it's something that has evolved as kind of a conversation in the culture, and we have a part in shaping. So before I jump into leadership and power as concepts and as words that we might redefine for ourselves or think about, I first want to just go over, like, why lead? Why is leading even important? I get that question a lot because not every woman or man wants to be a leader. They want to just maybe enjoy their job more or feel listened to or work differently. So, so before I get into that, I just sort of want to talk about this push for more assertive leadership on the part of women. So just a bit of perspective. Women are under 20% in government. Turns out we just made 100 women in Congress, which is wonderful, but I still believe that we're under 20%. Women make up half the workforce, but only 18% of top leadership positions across all sectors, just 18%. Women make up the majority of the nonprofit sector. I thought this was fascinating, about 75% of the nonprofit sector. And we know, of course, that salaries are so much lower in the nonprofit sector, and funding is really tricky and difficult in the nonprofit sector, and there are a lot of problems and opportunities there. And it's a whole different game when it comes to salaries and the way our organizations get supported. So 75% of the nonprofit sector is women. And then a bit more context, 1 in 3 women are living in poverty or on the brink of poverty. So when we think about why women need to lead, our very culture is imbalanced if you think about the information that is shaping it. If you think about who is leading our organizations and who is leading the conversations. In terms of this question of diversity and equity, recently Take the Lead did a webcast conversation on the profitability of diversity. I had the chance to attend, and it was actually wonderful with Cheryl Axelrod. But the whole conversation about diversity is tough for me because I think it's just the right thing to do. But beyond the fact that it's a social justice issue, there's an incredible conversation about how much more successful companies and organizations are when they have a more racially and ethnically diverse team and when they have a more diverse team in terms of gender. So a little bit of context. Companies with 3+ women on the board outperform companies with all male boards by about 60% return on invested capital, 84% on sales, and 64% on equity. The most racially diverse companies bring in 15 times more revenue than the least. And then there's incredible research out of MIT that the more women you add to a group, the smarter it is. So we can share that on Take the Lead later in terms of the actual article, but it's fantastic research that just shows the more difference you have in your group, the more intelligent it actually is, and the more you can outperform your competition. So beyond the fact that it's the right thing to do, it turns out diversity across kind of all categories is really important in terms of effectiveness. So let's get to talking about leadership and power, and then I want to hand it back to Caitlin. But what is leadership? I think leadership is inexplicably wrapped up in power. We think of the leader as hero. We have our movies where the hero is sort of in the leadership position. So we think of a heroic leadership, or the person who does things alone. But we actually have some choice here about how we understand leadership, because if you look throughout history, and if you look just around you in your community, you'll see that leadership is really about responsibility and contribution. And it looks like vision, it looks like voice, skill. It also looks like taking care of the health of a system. In this country, we don't value care work very much at all, if you think about teachers and nurses. But there are also people in our organizations who do great work, communications work, or kind of the work that is about connecting the dots strategically. And a lot of women are in those positions, whether or not they have the title of a strategic officer, a strategy officer. And so it's really about thinking of leadership as creating connections or connecting the dots. It's also about sustainability. Organization or a leader with great vision can't thrive if they can't keep the doors open, right? So it looks like we have a question. I don't know if we want to pause for a moment, Caitlin. Oh, we don't.
Oh, nope.
We'll keep going. The chat box. So that's a bit about a different take on leadership. But what about power? Again, lots of research and scholarship and interesting writings on power that many of you, I'm sure, have read. But our old definition of power, I think one that we operate a lot in still, is that it's about having power over others. Gloria Felt, co-founder of Take the Lead, writes and speaks about this quite a bit. That it's about trying to influence others and yield your influence over others and have them follow you. A new definition of power, which has been around just as long but is not as visible, is much more about your power to do something. The strategy thinker Adam Kahane calls this the drive of everything living to realize itself, or to achieve one's purpose, to get one's job done, or to grow. Again, power over is oppressive, and power to is expansive. It's full of possibility, and it can be inclusive. It not only emboldens us, but it's something that others can get behind. One quote that I want to share from Gloria Felt on power, which I love. She says, "Women are more likely to engage and be engaged by not screeching vehicular feats of daring, but by equally intense, too often silent tests of their personal agency." So for me, hearing that quote, reading that quote, it's like, okay, yeah, we have this sort of tension around power and around doing something differently or embracing our own power and what we know to be true about how we want to lead or what the right next step is, right? And that's really about these small tests of personal agency. It isn't always about being the hero. Another note about power is that I think as women, we talk a lot about how we naturally work in teams. And teams are really important. I talk and write a lot about the importance of teamwork. But there is a point where our interdependence with each other actually isn't helpful. We get so much done together, but we also have to recognize our own individual power too. Because if we limit our own growth by always saying, oh, taking no responsibility for our own agency, our own intelligence, our own contribution, then we are actually, that's a disservice because we're not honoring the individual contribution, which I'm going to talk about later. But that's just a bit of context around these two concepts and words that we have some choice around defining for ourselves.
And that actually leads perfectly into my next question, which is, why is authenticity and authentic leadership so important? You don't hear people talk about that a lot. It's just different ways of how to be a leader. But you're adding authentic leader. You're adding that authenticity aspect. So what's so important about that?
Yeah, I get fired up about this because authenticity is such a boring idea and such an exciting one at the exact same time. There's a lot of writing on authentic leadership out there. But the reason I want to keep having the conversation is that in the literature, we see a couple of things around authentic leadership. Certain studies in Harvard Business Review will say it's important to be an authentic leader, male or female, because you want your team members to follow you. You want them to trust you. And if you're authentic, they'll trust you, so then you'll perform better as an organization or as a team. The literature out there also says it's important to be an authentic leader or an authentic person because it's it's important to be who you are, and it feels good. What we don't talk about as often, and what I'm really offering to this conversation, is we don't talk about how the world actually needs our authentic contributions, our unique contributions. And in a world that is gender imbalanced, and imbalanced across race and ethnicity and class and so many other things that divide us, we're not getting the best, we're not getting all of the intelligence in the room, right? People don't, we don't hear from far too many voices in the room. So authenticity is about our unique contribution. The trouble with this is it's hard. We can talk all day long about the importance of difference and honoring difference. But if we're asking women or people of color to take on more leadership roles, but particularly in the women's leadership community, if we're asking women to step forward because it's so important that our voices be a part of the conversation, we must also equip our organizations and our systems to then deal with all of that new information. Because if you have so much difference, then how do you work together, right? So there's a place for kind of understanding what happens next. How do you deal with all of that all of those new contributions and all of that complexity that results from all of this new information to the system?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think it can be scary for some women, especially one if they're perhaps in a male-dominated industry. So they're in meetings and just in environments where it's all men, where they don't kind of see, you know, anyone who even looks like them. And I think also if you're aspiring to be successful, that almost attaches you to more strings because you're thinking, okay, the company is this way or the nonprofit is this way and I want to be successful, but I have a different idea. It's the difference. I have a different unique contribution.
Yeah. Exactly. So
but it's not going to get me in trouble.
So you know? Exactly. And I would say that goes back to that old definition of power, which is the oppressive power over that is about control. Old power is very much about control and being able to predict what happens next and having people follow you, right? That's the heroic leader and the oppressive power over. If you're asking women to step into leadership, that's about our power to, as we say, power to do something. But then what do you do? Because that means a lot of the old rules go out the window. Now, I'm not saying you just challenge and challenge and challenge and challenge the system all the time. You need to work with other people. But the system also needs to meet women halfway. And I think that's where this conversation comes into play. We as women or as marginalized voices need to examine our own relationship to power and take more risks and support each other and find our collaborators. But then our organizations, we need to figure out new ways of working together, because telling people what to do and just saying, trust me, it's going to work. I know how to run the economy. Look how well it's gone. It doesn't work anymore, right? We can feel that sea wave changing, sea change happening rather. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I want to bring us to your next point, which is this concept of power and influence. And I think many people conflate those two and see power and influence as the same thing. So what would you say is the difference between power over here and influence over here?
Yeah. So I do think they get confused very often. And I think this is often where women get tripped up and people get tripped up. Because who doesn't want to have influence, right? Whether it's influence over just one other person in a conversation in our personal or professional lives, or if we're a public figure or a leader within our organization or a writer or an actor or a creative person, you want to have influence. You want to make a difference and you want to be seen and visible and listened to. So power, even our power too, does go along with influence, absolutely. But they are still different things. So power, again, is about our contribution, our power to do something, our agency. I love that quote that I shared by Adam Kahane, every living thing's ability to realize itself. It's just powerful. Power is about the contribution we know we can make. And influence has much more to do with sort of our ability to persuade or bring people along with us. It's about message, resonance, kind of the power of our story and how it travels. So why does this matter? And why does it matter that they're even different and having this theoretical conversation. It matters because if we get too invested in having influence, it's putting the cart before the horse, one, but also we fly totally past that step of embracing our own power and really understanding what our unique contribution is. If we don't understand what our unique contribution is, then we can't execute that as well as we could otherwise, if we're just worried about what's going to happen next. And I think some of us, especially activists, especially speaking for myself, we get so invested in making people understand that we forget sometimes to really understand ourselves what our unique contribution is. So having some discernment around power versus influence requires slowing down. And if you overinvest in influence, ultimately you hurt yourself in the long run. I think that's the piece that we need to think about, the difference between the two.
So if we brought gender into this conversation, should we as women be working more toward changing our relationship with power than trying to exert influence?
I think we have to do both. But I guess the key idea is don't be distracted by influence. So don't start there. The example I always give is, think of pop stars who have one like really big, amazing album, and then they're not culturally relevant ever after that. Do you want to be that guy or that gal in your organization or in your work, in your field? Or do you want to have a different kind of power that, oh, by the way, influence people? Absolutely. But it's not just about numbers. Or let's say, you have a book and it sells really, really well. So you think, wow, I've got a lot of power. I've got a lot of influence. And those two things are all wrapped up, and I'm kind of at the top of the world. But then it fizzles out, whether it's your album or your book or your hotshot meeting at work. Or do you want to sort of have the kind of power where maybe fewer people are listening to what you say, but they're the right people? And then that book that isn't a bestseller lands in the right hands, and that leads to an incredible job or an incredible opportunity that you couldn't foresee, right? So if you shoot for influence, you might write a less impactful piece of work in the end, if that makes sense. That's the example that I always give. They're two fundamentally different things, power and influence. And we do need to look at both. But don't get distracted by the influence you're going to have. Influence happens as a result of getting really clear with yourself about what your contribution is.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, especially in an age of intense oversharing of information and the new technology we have. I'm thinking of a recent example. Some of you may have heard, if any of you are on Twitter, there was this young man who works at Target. And a picture of him went viral. And so did the hashtag Alex from Target. He's a teenage boy who works at Target as a cashier. It got millions of retweets, and there was nothing special about this. It was a picture of him bagging this woman's checkout items. And so I think everybody wants, right? That's like a small business owner's dream, right? Or like an entrepreneur's dream. I want something I make or something I put out there to go viral, right? We all kind of want that sort of influence. But what, and I don't know the latest on Alex from Target, but what was the purpose? Like, what was his unique contribution? It was just something that happened, and so he was incredibly influential, right? He was even on the Ellen DeGeneres, like went to his store and did like a feature on him. But then what was, like, how cool would it have been if he like featured a charity or was like, hey, check out like this movement I'm doing. You know what I mean? It was something that happened, but nothing happened.
Yeah, and it sounds like a silly example because it is silly. It's like all the cute animal videos that fly around, right? But it's really important to mention in this age of digital media and like hyper productivity. So I think it's a really good example because we do want our message to fly, and we do want to have influence at work and in the world, whatever our work is. And I think having discernment around power and our agency, our sense of felt personal agency, and our ability to have an impact and change an outcome is much more important than the virality of our short video online.
Exactly. So now moving back to power a little bit, power has been labeled as a negative quality.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had very many examples of positive power or power too. So it's often associated with patriarchy, and so then definitely not something that women would gravitate towards.
Mm.
So, but what you're saying and the philosophy of take the lead is saying that power can be a good thing, and that women and men can
Yeah.
use power for good. So let's dissect that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean to truly embrace our power, and what we can actually accomplish with that?
Sure. First, I want to say thanks for bringing up men. I had an incredible. I was at a conference. I gave a talk at a conference last week in Minnesota, and there was a wonderful talk by a woman, Kristen Mashka, who does a lot of work around supporting mothers in the workplace and out of the workplace. Kind of the supporting mothers as being more than mothers, right? You're a mother, but you're also a creative individual, and often mothers get treated as if they're just mothers and that's it. So anyway, she wrote an incredible book. She gave an incredible talk. But she did some really incredible scholarship at the University of Chicago, and she writes and speaks about this, about how our bias towards women is something that both men and women have, right? Which is fascinating. So you want to look up the work of Kristen Mashka, and I can send a link to her work once we wrap up. But anyway, I bring that up because women and men need to look at their relationship to power, and it's actually hard for men to embrace their power to do something in a way that isn't about having power over others, right? Because they're as invested in this old notion of power and these old systems that aren't working so well anymore, as we are, quite frankly, or as we're trapped in. And so I just sort of want to name that. You asked about sort of how we begin to embrace our power. Again, I want to loop in Gloria Felt's teaching because it's so important, and I believe strongly about sort of passing along. She talks about how we can reject the oppressive power over and still get really clear on what we want to do and need to do to get certain results. So you wouldn't let a patriarchal version of power that hasn't served for decades or centuries particularly well, creates wars sometimes, things like that, and sometimes wars are very necessary, but it's that old power over. You wouldn't sort of say, oh, I can't join that world, and therefore I can't have any decisive action. We're not saying by changing your relationship to power that you don't have decisive action, that you don't take action, that you don't have real clarity around what needs to happen next. It's not about saying that you need to agree with everybody in the room, or you always need to shoot for consensus. So she has this beautiful quote: what many women react to and resist are leaders who abuse power by enforcing the outmoded hierarchies and power over mode. And there's nothing inherently negative about being a leader or leading. I think that's just a really powerful statement. There's nothing inherently negative about being a leader or leading. And I would say it's the same about power. There's nothing inherently negative about having power. We know what having power feels like, whether it's a great workout, an incredible conversation where you make yourself heard and you hear the other person, feeling in your power with your girlfriends or your partner or your husband. We know what that feels like, to be generative, to be alive, to be creating something new in the world, right?
Yeah, and we use it. I think people feel more comfortable when you say, oh, we're empowering somebody, or this makes me feel empowered. Well, that's also power, empowered. So
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a little bit of a reframing in that way.
Yeah, but it's hard because it always takes guts. I think no matter where you are in your career, it takes guts, and anybody will tell you that. Often, embracing our power too, let's get concrete here for a minute, it means asking to be paid what we're worth. Because if we are stressing about money, or if we don't feel like we're getting what we deserve for our good work, or if if we're living paycheck to paycheck and we're not sort of feeling like our needs are met, then we can't really focus on the work that needs to be done. So that's sort of a tough thing. So embracing power too means asking for what we're worth. I think a lot of women are challenged with that. And then often embracing our power too and making a unique contribution, it creates controversy, chaos, and complexity. Gloria Felt and Take the Lead talk about this with our 9 power tools that Gloria teaches. But another thing that's really important is controversy sort of moves us, if you create a stir, that moves you towards future clarity. This was a really important learning point for me because I do a lot of work, again, talking about systems thinking and systems change and living systems, all these interesting sort of organizational change concepts that you study in business school or you study in nonprofit management school, then you kind of leave behind. But I sort of come at it from a very activist standpoint, like how are our systems broken? But what's really hard for me to deal with, so I'm very comfortable with change, but I'm not comfortable with controversy. And controversy does actually lead us to a different place. So I think a lot of us out there, I wish I could see you, I wish you were in the room, but you know what it feels like to have a really tough meeting or a lot of different opinions or disagreements, and there's this sense of controversy, and you think kind of all is lost. And then 3 weeks later, you realize that if you didn't have that hard conversation, you wouldn't be able to do what you're doing now, right? Individually or as a team. So chaos and controversy as a result of really making our unique contributions, all of those things increase the intelligence of the group. But we have to equip our teams and our organizations to be able to work with that complexity. So this is the fun part. If you want to get out your piece of paper, and I'm going to show you my piece of paper in just a moment so you don't have to worry about it. If you don't have a piece of paper, that's totally fine. Just turn your brain on and think of two lines, two curved lines. I want you to draw one upside down U, like this, and one regular U, like this. Do you see?
Yep, we see it.
And then you'll see some stars on the second U.
Mm-hmm.
You can draw your own stars. But this is a very important, and as you can see, very complex model I'm fitting. 2 U's, some arrowheads, and some stars. See the stars?
Yep.
Okay. Once you have that in front of you, this is a model for systems change and understanding systems change and how living systems stay resilient over time by Deborah Fries. You can look her work up online. She's a brilliant kind of change strategist and thinker. She does work with the Boston Impact Initiative in Boston right now. She also is at the Berkana Institute. But she talks about how in a living system, any living system, whether that's a swamp or a field or the earth or a community of people or an organization, it sort of has roots in ecology. But in any living system of living things, there's always a curve of things that are dying and a curve of things that are emerging, right? So this is the science of emergence. And we know what that feels like. You know when you feel stuck as an individual or a team or an organization, or when there's an issue in the world that is just stuck. That may be something that's dying or that needs to be reinvented. And you know what it feels like to have a lot of new energy. There's like this new initiative at work, or there's a new idea, or there's a new startup in your community that connects with a startup down the road, and then all of a sudden you have a little startup community. That's that new curve. So every time, I want you to look at your two curves or think about them in your head, and I'm going to hold this up again. But every time, see here, this is fun.
Yep.
Every time you use your power 2, you're placing yourself on the new curve. You're not trying to make an old thing that isn't working work. You're creating a new activity or a new piece of information or a new pattern in the system. To get more concrete with this, to give you an example, you might think that public healthcare in this country or our healthcare system in this country is working. Then you would place yourself over here on this line, and you would say, no, we're still on the upswing, things are going well. Maybe you think it's dying, but you don't know what comes next. You place yourself over here, and you're like, wow, look at this abyss. We're going to jump off a cliff. Things are really in bad shape. Or maybe you work for a medical device startup or a nonprofit group that is changing the face of healthcare and making sure people get served who don't have insurance or the care they need globally, and you would say, I'm over here. I'm creating the new, whether or not our current healthcare systems work for people. Does that make sense? I wish you were in the room. But if you have questions, just take a minute and type it in.
Yeah, that's a good visual to have. And it's
so just to wrap that up, every time you're using your power 2, you're adding your new information to that next curve. And I've begun using this model supporting women entrepreneurs, creative people, and leaders, whatever their work is. So you want to make sure that you get really clear about what your contribution, project, idea, whatever stage it is, and then you want to find your collaborators on that new curve, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. if you find your collaborators, those stars start to connect, and we'll talk about that momentarily.
So with systems change, let's talk about what is this leading against the tide idea? You know, it's the name of this virtual happy hour. So what is meant by this, and how do we do it?
Yeah. So I felt this in my own career. I hear from so many young women, and this has been my surprise, from women of all ages, and it doesn't matter what level you are in the organization or what kind of power and influence you have. I've heard that it's actually really hard sometimes to present a new idea or change old patterns of working and thinking. And we know this culturally, right? But in our teams, we really struggle with this, no matter what level we are. Plenty of men struggle with this as well. What do you do when you've got a new idea that you know could be very important, or a new way of working, or a new direction that you know could be very important for your team or community, and maybe it's just really hard to move forward, get any traction, get anybody to sort of join you, or get funding for. So that's where the leading against the tide idea came from. We all know that feeling. I know it well, and I've heard, unfortunately, that a lot of people struggle with that as well. And what I want to do is open it up and say, all right, so that's a reality that's never going to go away. Change is hard. Making a unique contribution is hard. Embracing power can be difficult and hard, but not all is lost. It also can be easy. You can think about sort of what comes next and think of complexity or of that tension as part of the process. So how do you lead against the tide? We'll talk about this in more detail shortly, but some really concrete ways that you can do it, and please take notes, is I love this because it sort of works whatever level you are in the organization. Really focus on identifying a gap. So a lot of us have things that we want to achieve ourselves, but if you're in a team that doesn't think the way you think, or an organization that has its own priorities, some of which line up with yours, or a community that has its own problems, some of which line up with yours, what you really want to do is identify a gap that others can get behind and understand. By a gap, I mean sort of a space that isn't being filled, or a problem, or an opportunity that others are already thinking about and listening to, right? And if you can link your new idea to that gap, you're in good shape. Not always, but often. Another thing that's very important is just the simple act of naming the problem or opportunity and speaking it and making it visible. I do a lot of work helping teams make their work visible as well. So that's another way to begin to connect the dots and begin to step forward and contribute something new. Get your people, I say your people, who are your collaborators in the room. So in your organization, if you have a new initiative or a new approach to the work or something you know that needs to happen, or in your community, or if you have an idea for a startup but you just don't know where to start, it's sort of like, of course there's going to be some discomfort around that because we're people and we have emotions, but apart from that, who are the people that need to be in the room with you? And most of us know those names in our organization or outside the organization if we're a freelancer. We know who might be a good person to talk to. And if you don't know, it's really worth thinking about that because you can't do anything alone. I believe that really strongly. Another way to lead against the tide is to ask for help from your advocates. Often these are men. Often they're women, but often they're men. Interestingly, I do a lot of work around women's leadership, but in and outside of my editorial work, whether it's my editorial or my dialogue work or my speaking, it's been a lot of men that have supported me through and through. And that's just by chance, but I think it's important to recognize our allies. Something a little bit similar to identifying a gap, you want to link your project to other things happening in the community. And when I say project, I mean that in the broadest and the smallest sense. And so I'm going to go into some examples in a moment. I think, Caitlin, you wanted to go over some concrete examples, and we'll talk about that, exactly how people sort of link their issue to something else already happening.
Yeah, so why don't we just move straight on into people who are leading in this way and can serve as examples of leading against the tide.
Sure. So I chose two women, but they could easily just be men. I could be any gender, but I chose sort of a very public, hugely important and influential and powerful person, a Supreme Court Justice as a first example, Sonia Sotomayor. So as an example of leading against the tide in an unconventional way. So some of you may remember earlier this year, I believe it was in the spring, the Supreme Court upheld Michigan's constitutional amendment banning the consideration of race in university admissions. So essentially banning affirmative action in Michigan. And Sotomayor wrote a 58-page dissent saying that the way to address racial discrimination is to name it and face it head on, understanding its effects today and not wishing it away. So the Supreme Court made its decision, but Sonia Sotomayor wrote this incredibly influential and powerful dissent. It flew around the web. Talk about virality of videos. The memes went around the web with her face and beautiful quotes talking about how we cannot wish away racism, we have to actually deal with it. And just this week in Dallas, there's a Facing Race conference that has been happening for several years, and our country is beginning to do that more and more and more. So by using her voice, she really led against the tide and still had influence, even though the actual policy decision, unfortunately, was what it was. And I'll just be honest, I think it was the wrong decision. So now the organizational purpose of the court is social justice, right, and setting a cultural standard for us all to live by. But Sonia Sotomayor's individual purpose sort of is beyond her job role. So she fulfilled her job role, but then she used her voice, she wrote this incredible dissent, and she pushed the conversation on race forward. And by doing that, we have new language around race and how to approach such a difficult and painful subject in our country, and move forward in terms of the actual thinking about race relations, which is huge and important and something I think we're really wrestling with right now. So that's a very public, big example of leading against the tide, even though the decision was that it was at the organizational level. And I don't think we would say that she was ineffective, right? She made history by doing that. Another example is a smaller one, although this person has quite a public presence. She's been featured on NPR. She's an entrepreneur and an activist. Her name is Natalia Oberti-Noguera. I know her from my early days of being involved with an organization, No Country for Young Women, which featured the voices of young leaders across the country. You can still find the website. But Natalia founded an organization to help women and women of color become angel investors in women-led social enterprises and startups. So I want to highlight her because she's a powerhouse. She's incredibly proactive, and she filled a gap. So she did research. I don't think everybody has to be an academic to lead, but she happened to do really interesting research on why men get funded so much more by venture capitalists, men-led startups than women-led startups. And it turns out that the people who get funded are white men, white, handsome men, by white men. And of course, they wouldn't say they're doing it because of a racist bone in their body. It's just a pattern. It's called pattern recognition. It turns out the psychology of giving is that you fund people who look like you. But what that leads to is racist and sexist decisions and policies about what work we value in our country, right? Whether it's privatized or a public thing. So we really need to understand the problem of pattern recognition. So Natalia Oberti-Noguera created an organization to say, okay, that's the problem that's happening with white men funding other white men rather than women-led startups or women of color-led startups. All right, or people of color-led startups. So let's train the women who have money, and surely there are women and women of color out there who have money to fund women-led startups and startups led by people who look different than the white man in the room, right? So she did an incredible job, and she used her voice and her personal power to start this organization. They've been around for several years now, and it's been incredibly powerful. So that's an example of someone who's in the business and entrepreneurial community making a difference by using her power too. She's quite successful doing it. You can find out more about Pipeline Fellowship online. But they train women to become angel investors. And then that network has spread and spread and spread. And all of those people are continuing to shift the very face of venture capital funding.
Great. So we have about 15 more minutes. So these examples, they use their power to accomplish their goals. And in this way, they were leading differently to create new opportunities and positive opportunities.
Yeah. So yeah, they embraced their unique contribution. They had a willingness to say a hard thing or a new thing. In the case of Sotomayor, it was this incredible 58-page dissent In the case of Natalia Bertino-Guerra, she speaks openly about racism. If there's an all-male panel or an all-white panel, she calls it out on social media. So not only does she has she contributed her unique power to the larger system of funding and what gets funded in our startup community, our entrepreneurial community, but as a leader, as an individual, she's created her own press, and she's been quite impactful in her individual actions. And all of those new actions are modeling really powerful actions for other women leaders. Not all of us are going to be this visible, but I wanted to show two really powerful examples so that you begin to get a feel for what that power to looks like and feels like. And it involves a willingness to create a stir, but that doesn't mean you do it out of context. And so learning about these organizations, like Natalia's Pipeline Fellowship, is a really good way to do that, just to see what that looks like in practice. If you're going to embrace your individual power too, you have to really speak from your lived experience, and I think that's what's so hard for women entrepreneurs and creative people and leaders within or outside of organizations. We're asking women to speak from their lived experience about bias or to work in gender-biased systems, and then we're coming up against some tension. So we have to create new ways of working, and that's what that two loops model, the 2U model, is about.
So if we narrow it down and bring it back to all of us and just the individual everyday worker,
yeah.
What do you do if chaos and leading against the tide, going against the grain, is very uncomfortable? You know, women and men are going about their everyday daily work, which for most of us can be hard enough as it is, and you know, there's different stresses. So and they don't necessarily want to deal with anything that they don't want stress on top of the stress they already have. So so what advice do you have for others if leading against the tide and this sort of chaos from doing something differently at work, which takes a lot of guts, what would you say if it even just the idea of that feels very uncomfortable?
Totally get it. I completely understand. And I balance this every day too, right? Because one of the things that's hard about the women's leadership movement is sometimes you just want to do your work. You don't want to be a women's leadership activist on top of your everyday job, right? Because not all of us are speakers or writers on women's leadership. That's not the point. So I really appreciate the question. And when you do lead against the tide, or you really kind of move forward, embrace your power to rethink your relationship to power and make a new contribution, finding your collaborators, finding your allies, it still doesn't feel good sometimes because it's going against the grain. So that's just something that's part of the experience of leading, even if it's leading in a small way or a big way. Some of us remember the novelist Bernard Malamud. His daughter, Jana Malamud Smith, calls this the attendant distress of creative practice. So I guess I would just offer that as a way of reminding ourselves that this happens no matter what our work is, whether we're writing or we're starting a company or we're making a different move in the organization. It's just the attendant creative distress, the attendant distress of creative practice. Doing something different is going to be uncomfortable. Another piece of advice that I would give is you need to find your community in your organization and outside. One way that can work is by, let's say you have a difficult situation at work. You want to find the person in the meeting who can say, so-and-so has just been interrupted 12 times. Or, you know, so-and-so had a really wonderful idea, and I don't feel like we stayed with that long enough. Can we return to that? So often, I'll have a male colleague or a female colleague do that for me so that I'm not always defending myself. If I'm in a room where people literally cannot see me because of their own gender bias, right? Even though I'm leading. And that happens with women and with men. You're making a unique contribution, but there's this old power over hierarchical thing that doesn't work so well anymore. I'm not saying hierarchy isn't important. I am saying that we need new ways of working with each other in our meetings and our conversations if we're going to ask for more voices in the room. So find your community in your organization, find people who can advocate for you and slow a meeting down, and also find your community in terms of the women creative people or men creative people who you can have other conversations with outside of the office to talk about what you want to create and all those new sparks on that new curve. I'd also say stay curious. So while leading against the tide makes you feel uncomfortable, if you can stay with the curiosity, then it's an intellectual endeavor. And you're going to find support for what you're doing because you're staying with that initial thread of your idea, whether it's an idea for an organization or a new effective strategy at actually supporting your company better and meeting a certain objective.
So we're about to go into Q&A. So if you have a question, please type them in. But one more question for you, Lex, is so what are the tangible takeaways you can leave us with in order to effectively lead against the tide?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to say, like, you all are doing it. If this conversation resonates with you, and it's so much more fun when we're in a room, but I'm delighted to do it via webcast. You all are doing it already. So I just want to acknowledge that. I write and speak about how the wisdom is already in the room. Well, it's already here. So I just want to sort of applaud everybody here for stepping into your leadership clearly. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here in this conversation. I also want to say just a concrete thing you can do is if you haven't already done this, who on your team or in your community can hold you accountable for that new stretch goal, right? So if we think about new ways of working or new contributions or where we actually aim to fill a gap or make a unique contribution, big or small, who can hold you accountable to that? I would write those names down and then have a conversation. And maybe you start a circle and you meet once per month with 3 other women. Maybe you do that via Google Hangout. That's personally what I do, and I find it incredibly helpful because I'm building muscle for embracing my power too, instead of just fighting what doesn't work sometimes. And I'm very lucky that in all of my projects, I feel able to move forward and lead in a bunch of different ways, but we don't all have it so easy. And of course, I run into that same trouble. So by having this really supportive, creative group that embraces power too, rather than trying to vie for power in that group, I'm building muscle and I'm having fun and I'm working with people to support me in that process of moving my work forward. It's not my work alone. I think we forget that and we think we're more alone than we are. So think about who are your collaborators as well. This is a little bit different. So who in your community can support you? But then whether you know them or not, who are your collaborators? So if you're a writer, it may be someone at your media company or outside of your media company who's writing about the same things, thinking about the same things, picking up on the same things. If you're a strategist, who is writing about strategy in various journals and really like thinking how you think? Who are your collaborators? If you're a startup and maybe you're 4 or 5 years old and you have some traction and you've got other business problems or you've got a great nonprofit, but you don't know where next year's funding is coming, who are the people who are in your crew, whether you know them or not, whether they live in your community or not? We have an incredibly connected world now, so find those people and try to connect with them and talk about problems and opportunities. And the last question that I would offer, and I wrote about this recently, is ask yourself where you find alignment with yourself, your organization, and the larger cultural shift. That's a big question, but it really is an important one to think about what makes you come alive, and it also informs very concretely what your next step may be, because you want to situate yourself in context. You don't want to act alone. Power too, as much as it's about embracing our individual power, it's absolutely about being connected to something bigger than ourselves. A few concrete learning opportunities. Some of you know about this organization, but I highly, highly recommend the Op-Ed Project, which isn't just for writers. It's about understanding your value of your own work. It's a really important program, and they have scholarships. So check out the Op-Ed Project online. I said start a circle and check out Take the Lead's Close the Gap app, because it sort of helps you think about your career path, not just the pay equity piece. And I think as we look at our power and our relationship to our power and what we want to do next, that career path piece, we have to think about that, because it's really important. We can't just be creative all the time. We also have to be really skillful planners.
Awesome. And I would also say there, our founder, Take the Lead's founder, Gloria Felt, does teach a 4-week online course called the 9 Practical Leadership Power Tools to Advance Your Career, where she goes, she takes what your goals and what your passions are for your life, but especially in your career and in your work life, and how to get there, and how to use the power that you already have inside you in order to get there. She always says that, women don't need to change. Everyone's talking about, well, women just did this, you just did this. And she always says, well, women are just fine the way we are, actually. So it's just about tapping into the different strengths and abilities and knowledge that you already have inside you. And there's a graphic on this page on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can click on that for to get more information on that course. But now I would like to move into the Q&A portion. We have a couple minutes left on our virtual happy hour. So type in those questions. We have a few more minutes. But we'll start with this question that was submitted. They're asking if could you give an example of you when you saw a tide coming and you led against the tide and you created an opportunity out of leading against the tide. If you had a successful example of doing that, even though it was scary,
Yeah,
you did it, and there was something that came out of it.
sure. So it's a good question, and it really makes me think, again, from sort of a heartfelt place about what's made the difference. So I had a startup for 4 years in Boston before I sort of committed to freelance editorial work and content development, essentially, and doing women's leadership work, which is what it is for now. But in my startup, it was still about how ideas travel and how to make meaning out of something. So I was an editor for a knowledge-sharing media startup in an economic recession. Great choice in my early 20s, but it actually was. It was the best move I ever made. It was fascinating. I learned so much, and my co-founder and I and our small team got a lot of press despite the business challenges of it. We all worked part-time. It was really, really hard. But here's an example of how I led against the tide, or started to begin to understand work that way. So our goal was featuring nonprofits and for-profits who are doing something different, not just to band-aid social ills, not to just put a band-aid on something, but to address a root cause. And we weren't so interested in sort of their impacts being huge. We just wanted the impacts to be different. And the idea, of course, was to make visible this good work, so maybe that they could get funded. So for organizations that are too busy making sure people get food or clothing that they need, or housing needs, how do we tell the stories of those organizations? There are a lot of organizations doing this now, but when we started, maybe there were 30% less. Anyway, it was a hard thing and a really wonderful, rewarding thing. We did a lot of videos and articles and community building in Boston. But one thing that we found was that a lot of the race and social justice activists in Cambridge weren't talking to the race and social justice activists in Dorchester. And we started featuring various organizations, but we noticed that they weren't connected, and that the funding organizations may or may not be connected to those people. And people were all competing for grants, right? And the nonprofit world is changing. We're trying to move away from this sort of false competition because we're all working on a lot of the same issues. So long story short, we didn't know how to really add value. It was like throwing darts. We want to make work visible. We want to support these things. It was all so earnest and big and heartfelt. But what we did was we hosted a conversation, and we invited people. And by calling the executive directors of these organizations, one of which went on to run for political office, is a very well-known Massachusetts leader, they said yes immediately. Another was a scholar from Harvard Law School. They said yes immediately to early 20-somethings women, their first startup, their first organization, a community conversation at the Boston Public Library. And then the conversation was taped, and it was an incredible, alive, generative, cool conversation. And now those two organizations are aware of each other in a way that they weren't before, or maybe they weren't in those years. Maybe they had been years ago. By just embracing our naming a gap, seeing a disconnection and moving on it, we added value. And that startup eventually ended, but it led to new and different opportunities in my career, and then for the larger ecosystem of the Boston startup and nonprofit scene later on. So I hope that helps as an example.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And we are actually out of time for tonight, but you all will be receiving a recording of this webcast. And so if you rewatch certain parts of it or at any time you have a question, you can email Lex. And also, she writes about different issues like this on the Movement blog, which is Take the Lead blog. So you can, I definitely recommend checking her out. She's a brilliant writer. It's just taketheleadwomen.com, and you can find our Movement blog right on there. Lex, are you comfortable if I send them your email in the follow-up if they wanted to shoot you an email?
Absolutely. And since so much of this I've talked about sort of different conversations that we need to be in with each other. If you're in the New York area, I'll be hosting some events and some conversations totally free in the coming months. So please email me if you're interested. With a small team, it's not going to be the Lex show. It's going to be a small team convening conversations as a large group, working with all of the intelligence in the room. So we'll be practicing what we're preaching here, I hope. And I look forward to hearing from you. And Caitlin, thank you so much. I so admire Take the Lead, and I'm proud to work with you guys.
Well, thank you, Lex. Thank you, Lex, for being our thought leader for tonight's virtual happy hour. And Take the Lead will be having more virtual happy hours. Again, you can check out that on taketheleadwomen.com. So thank you all for joining us today, and go forth and be authentic.
Thank you.